So whatever child actor we have assigned to this slot here, this component, that will spawn automatically in the world when we start. Let's go over to weapon base. And as always, we'll just do a little bit of a troubleshoot here. When we hit begin play, we're just going to do a print string. If you have too many print strings saying hello, then you're going to get a little confused. So let's say I am a weapon. Compile, save, hit play. There it is. Our weapon spawned. And any weapon that we put in this class would fire that same script. So that's great. Now, also, if you've already hit play and noticed that this weapon is unfortunately placed, and also you will notice that it's not moving with us, that's because at the moment we're using a placeholder camera actor. When you're playing a first-person game, most of the time your weapon and your arms are attached to the camera because the camera is what we're controlling with the mouse. So if I look to the left, then the arms and the weapon are going to also follow me to the left. What we need to do is add that camera into our character, which is really easy. All we're going to do is type in camera. There's our camera. And this is where attachment comes in. Now, if you were to make some sort of third-person, first-person game where you can switch between the two, say like classic Bethesda games, then you would have two cameras here, and one of them would be attached to the head, and the other one would be attached to an arm behind you. Maybe later on down the line we'll look at that, but that's a different control scheme. So just for clarity, I'm going to rename this to camera_FPS. Now I'm going to bring that camera up by using the arrows. Let's see what 50 looks like. That's a bit better. Also, now that we have a camera in here, we have to tell that camera that we can look up and down. All we have to do is click on use pawn control rotation. And there we go. Compile, save, play, and now we can look around, back to where we were. Now we have something to attach our weapon to. So let's grab our equipped weapon and attach it to the FPS camera. You can see here that it's trying to readjust itself to where it was. Seeing as this camera is 50 plus, it's automatically gone 50 negative just to be where it used to be, so it doesn't get too out of whack. But we do want that weapon quite close to the camera. Here's where fine tuning will come in. So I'm going to start at 0. And I'm going to use the arrows, turning my snaps down, to adjust this into a position that looks kind of cool. All right, so I'm pretty happy with that. I'm just going to leave it there. Obviously, I can fine tune it later on, and you can spend as long as you want here trying to fine tune it. I would suggest not going too crazy because we don't have any arms to reference at this point in time, and that's going to be definitively where it sits. It has to sit in the hand and pressed against the arms. So this is, again, just so we get a feel for it, so we know which weapon we have equipped and we can start testing out our weapons. If you want to copy my exact coordinates, I'm using 20 on the X, 15 on the Y, and minus 25 on the Z. So now that I know what weapon I have equipped and it looks half decent, we can get on to setting up that weapon and how we're going to shoot it. When I want to talk to this weapon and tell it to fire, all I actually have to do in here is drag and drop this in. So now, for these particular 4 events, when I fire a weapon, I know which weapon I'm talking to based on whichever weapon I put in this slot. When I reload a weapon, again, I know which weapon I'm talking to. When I switch weapons, I know which slot to change, and when I aim weapons, I know which iron sights I'm looking down. What we need to do now is create the script inside of the weapons to trigger these events, and then we can trigger that code or that script through this node here. But to progress any further, we need to talk about another concept in Blueprints that translates right across every coding language as far as I know. That concept is functions. To do this, let's pop over to our core and double click on our hero. We created this health script a few episodes ago. Any character that can take damage would have this script fired. So we don't want to have to copy and paste this every single time. This is where functions comes in. And yes, I'm talking about every character, so we need to be talking about the base character. Open up the base character, and with these two side by side, what we're going to do is create a function. Here's how a function works. Instead of calling this line of script over and over again and having to write it out every single time, a function compiles it down to one node that we can call from any instance of that blueprint class. Let's grab all of these nodes, including our print strings, because we're going to test this. The only one we're not going to grab is H. Let's hold Control and press C. We're going to go over to base character and hit over here on the left above variables and macros, we want to hit functions and create a new function. We're going to call this function affect health. Now we're going to hold Control and press V. Line up your nodes with this new function head right here. At the end, we're going to put a return node. Plug in your return node and hit compile and save. There's our function. Now, when we want to subtract our health, instead of calling this script all bare bones, we now have a nice, neat little package that we can call instead. Let's right click here in our hero character and type in affect health. And there we have our function called affect health. So we can get rid of all of this and hit delete. And now I'm going to plug in H into affect health. Compile, save, test, play, click on the level, hit H. Would you look at that? Our health is going down. Now, let's go and put that exact same script to use over in our base enemy. Double click on base enemy, open in full blueprint editor, drag the tab to the top, and we can right click and type in affect health. There we go. We can affect health now directly to our enemy, and we can affect health on our hero based on a function we created in the base character. And we can do the exact same thing with NPCs, friendlies later on down the line. So there's one more thing we need to add to this particular function before we can move on though. This right here is a fixed damage interval. We can't change this in the function the way it is. Basically, any number you put in here is going to be fixed unless it's attached to a variable. Our health can change, and thus this equation can run differently according to where health is, but our damage is what cannot change, and we need to be able to change that. So to do that, we're going to click on health, go over to the right where it says inputs, hit a new parameter. You'll see here that it's created a node attached to affect health. Type in delta. Click the drop down because we want to float. Now we can plug this delta into this damage variable, which might not make a lot of sense right now, but let's go over to our hero character and have a look at that node. Now we have a delta. And so now when we affect the health of a character, we can decide how much damage that is. For testing purposes, let's get random float in range. And we're going to type in 1 for our minimum and 10 for our maximum. Let's pretend that this random float in range was damage coming from different enemies. Every time I hit H, that delta is going to communicate with that function to give it a different value, thus different damage from different enemies. Let's test that out. Hit play in our level and hit H. And you can see that we're getting different damage values every time we hit H. Later on, we're going to change the random float in range because we're going to get damage from a source to plug into here. So that damage value will come from the enemy, but we're also going to get a different event here, which will be another communication method, which we're going to talk about later. Back to functions, you might be asking, well, what does functions have to do with weapons? Let's have a look at our weapons for a second. 4 out of 5 of these weapons are going to use the same function to shoot. To keep it simple, we're going to be using a technique called line tracing, which is basically going to draw a line from our character straight ahead, and that line trace is then going to determine what it's hit. If it's an enemy, then it's going to subtract health. We could get more complex in the future where we actually shoot a projectile, and that projectile has different properties depending on how big the bullet is. But that's going to be something we do much later on down the line. It's a little bit too advanced for a beginner tutorial. Because we're creating a function that's going to be used across all of these weapons, we're going to create that function in our weapon base. If we pop over to the right and click on functions, we can now call this function fire weapon. This fire weapon function is going to be the function we call every time we pull our right mouse button. We're going to just add a print string in here because we need to do a few more steps before we get into actually firing this function from our character. And we're going to call this one fire weapon, just so we know it's working. We're going to create another function which is going to be called reload weapon. Reloading is actually going to be an identical process. Doesn't matter how many bullets you have in your gun, the same equation is going to be played out. We're probably going to dedicate an entire video just to the reloading process. But for now, let's do a print string. And you guessed it, we're going to call it reload weapon. Compile and save. So now all that we're missing is one more method for us to talk to this weapon. We could cast to this weapon. We could, for instance. So if we drag off this and we get child actor. So we could do casting. Now, here's a really cool thing about casting. We don't have to talk to the weapons individually. We can talk to their parent class. So because they all have the same parent, so long as we want to talk to those particular variables or functions, we could go cast to base weapon or weapon base. And we could do it that way. So I could drag off here and I could type in fire. And there's my function, fire weapon. And now when I pull the trigger, lo and behold, fire weapon is firing. And that wouldn't matter which weapon is in that slot because all of them have the same parent actor. This might be getting a little bit confusing, but we're just going to keep going over and over this stuff until it glues, which hopefully isn't too much. And the same can be said for reloading a weapon. Now, don't worry too much about copying exactly what I'm doing because I actually want to use a different method here to communicate. I just want to show you that this is one way you could have potentially done it. So this is a little more educational, which is fine. I think it's good to go over the potential methods. Also, if you watch another tutorial and another tutorial does it this way, then you know that they're not necessarily doing it wrong. They're doing it a different way, which is absolutely fine. So all we have to do is change this to reload weapon. And there we go. Now when we press E, because we haven't separated our keys yet, compile save, we should be reloading our weapon. Reload weapon popping up. Back over in weapon base, you can see here that this is a different event graph. If we wanted to get back to the original event graph, the primary event graph, all we have to do is click on the tab here. So there's a second set of tabs here, and anytime you open a function, that's where that new tab will come up. So we click on event graph, let's get rid of print string and compile and save.